A retired Special Forces veteran and his once legendary working dog have been living quiet in a winter forest, patching together a life one silent day at a time, trying not to hear the old war inside their bones. But tonight, inside an abandoned warehouse, they find something colder than the snow outside. A police officer and her K9 bound and hanging in midair like a message waiting for its owner to read. The thugs didn't come to steal money. They came to steal dignity, to make fear speak louder than justice. And the real tragedy isn't the rope. It's what their cruelty awakens in a man who buried his past so deep he thought it was gone. A ghost of the battlefield they should have never disturbed. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of loyalty, faith, and courage. Snow fell in slow, ash-like sheets over Pine Hollow's pines, and the wind worried the treetops until they sounded like an old animal breathing through cracked ribs. Jack Mercer walked beneath it all as if winter had a personal grudge. He was 40, but the years that mattered weren't on calendars. They were in the way his shoulders stayed slightly forward, ready for impact. In the way his gaze kept measuring exits, even when there was nothing to escape from but silence. Jack's hair had once been a deep brown. Now gray threaded his temples like frost that refused to melt. He kept it cut short, not for style, but because long hair grabbed sweat, and sweat carried the scent of fear. A close-trimmed beard sharpened the angles of his jaw and made him look less approachable than he actually was. His eyes were a cold steel blue that had learned how to stay calm while the world screamed. People who didn't know him called that hard. People who did called it careful. He wore the same uniform every day. Now worn brown leather jacket, scuffed at the elbows and faded along the seams. A red and black plaid flannel underneath, blue jeans, tall brown lace-up boots that could handle ice, mud, and the long walk back to being human. He lived on 20 rough acres near the edge of town, where the road thinned into gravel and then into wishful thinking. At his heel moved a German shepherd with the solemn patience of a sentry. Ranger was 8 years old enough to have earned the stiffness in his back leg on cold mornings. Old enough to carry the weight of memory in his eyes. His coat was a deep black and tan, thick along the neck, slightly silvering at the muzzle in a way that made him look wise rather than tired. One ear held a small notch, the kind of scar that said there had been a moment once where pain was optional and duty wasn't. Ranger's chest was broad, his muscles still tight beneath the fur, but he no longer wasted energy. He watched, he listened, he waited. He didn't chase squirrels. He didn't bark at shadows. He had been trained once, long ago, to treat the world like a door that might open the wrong way at any second. They were both retired, in the strict sense, and neither of them believed retirement meant peace. Jack had come to Pine Hollow for quiet, because quiet didn't ask questions. He took odd jobs that paid cash, mending fences, hauling scrap, clearing deadfall after storms. Not because he loved the work, but because the rhythm of labor kept his hands busy when his mind tried to claw backward. The town let him be mostly. People here had their own troubles, bills, marriages, old injuries that ached when weather changed. They nodded at Jack in the general store and didn't pry. That was the unspoken bargain. He wouldn't bring his ghosts into their kitchens, and they wouldn't shine flashlights into his. Even so, ghosts were patient creatures. That morning, Jack had been fixing a fence line for Earl Whitman, a retired logger who lived a mile down the road in a sagging farmhouse that smelled permanently of coffee and pine sap. Earl was in his late 60s, thick through the middle, with hands like knotted rope and a face that held a lifetime of sun and sawdust. He talked too much when he was nervous and made jokes when he didn't know what else to do with worry. "You're a lifesaver, Mercer," he'd said, passing Jack a thermos. "If the deer don't eat my fence, the winter will." Earl's laugh had been a rough cough, and his eyes had flicked to Ranger as if asking the dog's permission to be friendly. Ranger had merely blinked, slow and assessing, and Earl had decided he was allowed to exist. Jack finished the last staple, tugged the wire until it sang tight, and stepped back to inspect his work. The fence was straighter now than it had any right to be, considering the ground was half frozen and the posts were older than Jack's patience. He should have been satisfied. He should have walked home, warmed his hands by the stove, and let the world stay outside. Instead, Ranger stopped. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden bark, no lunging charge. Ranger simply froze mid-step, one paw lifted, nose angling toward the east where the trees thickened and the land dipped into a forgotten stretch of old industry. The dog's ears went forward sharp, deliberate. The muscles along his shoulders tightened. Jack felt it too, not as a thought, but as a shift in pressure behind his ribs. "What is it?" Jack murmured, though he knew better than to speak as if this was a casual question. He followed Ranger's gaze. Beyond the fence line, past a narrow strip of brush and a shallow drainage, an abandoned warehouse sat like a blunt memory. It had been part of an old milling operation years back when Pine Hollow still tried to pretend it could become something bigger. Now the building was a hulking shell, corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, windows punched out, roof line sagging slightly under the burden of snow. The big sliding door hung crooked, half open, as if the warehouse itself were caught mid-confession. Jack had driven past it plenty of times without looking. That was his specialty, seeing things and choosing not to. Ranger's nostrils flared. His breathing changed, subtle but unmistakable. The dog had caught a scent that wasn't just animal or weather. Jack knew the categories. Oil and metal were normal near that place. Remnants of machines tended to linger like a stale prayer. But there was something else riding the cold, air-sharp, sour, human. Fear. The word wasn't poetic, it was practical. Fear had a smell. Jack had learned it overseas under a sun that felt too close to the earth, learned it in dust and sweat and diesel fumes. Ranger had learned it beside him. They didn't imagine fear, they recognized it. Jack's first instinct was to turn away, not because he was a coward, because he had paid the price of curiosity before. Curiosity had a habit of opening doors that should stay shut. His life now depended on closed doors. He tightened his grip on his tool bag and forced his shoulders to relax. "Come on," he said, gentle, as if he could persuade the world back into its proper shape. "Not our problem." Ranger didn't move. Jack stared at the warehouse again, annoyed at himself for even considering it. The snow made everything look clean, like the forest had been freshly forgiven. That was winter's trick covering ugliness and pretending it no longer existed. Jack had fallen for that trick once too, thinking that if he buried the past under enough quiet, it would stop breathing. He had promised himself after the last mission, after the radio went dead at the worst possible time, after a friend didn't come home, that he would never go looking for trouble again. That promise had become a kind of religion. It kept him alive, but it also kept him alone. And sometimes, Jack suspected, it kept him smaller than he deserved to be. Ranger took one step toward the warehouse, then another, and looked back at Jack. There was no pleading in the dog's face, no panic, just insistence, as if Ranger were saying, "This is the line, this is where we stand." Jack felt heat rise under his collar that had nothing to do with exertion. Anger at the world for daring to need him again, at himself for still having something inside him that responded. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog and vanish. "You always pick the worst days," he muttered to Ranger, the closest thing to humor he'd offered in weeks. Ranger's tail gave one restrained sweep, not happy, not playful, just ready. Jack started walking, the snow under his boots packed with a quiet crunch. Each step toward the warehouse felt like stepping into a story he didn't want to reread. The trees closed around him, their branches heavy with white, making a tunnel of winter. The air smelled of pine and iron. The closer he got, the more the warehouse seemed to swell in his vision, as if it resented being approached. Halfway across the drainage, a sound scraped the air metal on metal, high and ugly, like a door being forced or a chain dragged across a beam. Jack stopped instantly. Ranger stopped with him, head low, ears forward. The sound came again, followed by a muffled voicemail, laughing. Another voice answered, sharper, as if warning the laughter to hush. Jack's pulse tightened, not racing, but narrowing, focusing. The old discipline slid into place over his thoughts like armor. Observe, identify, assess, don't rush. He crouched behind a fallen log, pulling Ranger close without touching the dog's collar. Ranger stayed pressed at Jack's side, silent, his body warm and solid. Jack's mind flickered to the last time he'd heard men laugh like that, careless, cruel, sure of their own power. He remembered the aftermath more clearly than the laughter, the cost, the damage, the way you could never fully scrub someone else's violence off your hands even if you hadn't started it. He looked at Ranger and saw the same question reflected back. Are we leaving, or are we standing? Jack felt the old vow tug at him, stay out, stay hidden. But another vow, older and deeper, rose up beneath it. Protect the vulnerable. Don't let cruelty have the last word. He had tried to bury that second vow because it hurt too much to keep it alive. Yet here it was, breathing, stubborn as winter. Quiet, Jack whispered, not as an order, but as a promise. Ranger's eyes never left the warehouse door. Jack slid his hand into his jacket and touched the small knife he carried. Not for heroics, but because the world sometimes demanded a hard answer. He listened again. Another scrape, another laugh. And beneath it, faint like a thread pulled tight, something else. A stifled sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Human, restrained, swallowed back. Fear again. Fresh. Close. Jack's jaw clenched. He could walk away right now. He could go home and let the sheriff handle it, assuming the sheriff ever found out before it was too late. He could pretend he'd heard nothing. That was the easiest route. It was also the route that would keep him awake for the next 10 years. He rose slowly from behind the log, moving like he had been taught. Small profile, controlled breath, no wasted motion. Ranger mirrored him. Together, they advanced through the last stretch of trees until the warehouse loomed just ahead, the doorway a mouth of shadow. Jack paused at the threshold. The cold air that spilled out smelled of oil, dust, and something human that didn't belong in a forgotten building. Ranger's hackles lifted a fraction. Jack Mercer, the man who had come to Pine Hollow to disappear, stood with one foot in the snow and one foot in the dark, and felt the ghost of his old life take a step beside him. Then he moved forward, because some doors only open one way, and because even a buried oath can still bite when it's disturbed. Inside the warehouse, the air was colder than the snow outside, as if the building had learned how to hoard winter. Light slid through gaps in the roof in thin, pale blades, cutting across floating dust and the silhouettes of old machinery that looked like sleeping giants. Jack Mercer stepped just past the threshold and stopped, because the scene in front of him did what bullets used to do. It reorganized his entire nervous system in an instant. In the center of the open floor, beneath a skeletal overhead beam, a woman hung by rope with her wrists bound behind her back. Her boots swung a few inches above the cracked concrete, knees bent from exhaustion, shoulders pulled tight in a way that would start to burn and then become a different kind of pain. Her face was turned slightly toward the light as if she'd been forced to look at it. Auburn hair darkened by sweat and dust had slipped loose from a ponytail sticking to her cheek. Freckles crossed the bridge of her nose, and there was a thin cut near her eyebrow that had dried into a small crescent. Even so, her eyes were steady. Not calm. Steady. The difference mattered. Calm was comfort. Steady was choice. She was 35 by Jack's quick read. Not young enough to be reckless, not old enough to be jaded, the kind of age that still believed it could save people if it moved fast enough. Her uniform had been stripped of anything easy to grab. No hat, no coat buttoned wrong, no dangling radio, yet it was clearly law enforcement. Dark navy jacket with a worn patch on the upper arm, black tactical pants, a duty belt now missing the obvious pieces. The rope had rubbed the fabric raw at the wrists. She had fought. That was obvious. She had just lost the numbers game. Beside her, suspended from the same beam, hung a German Shepherd K9. The dog was about 6, black and tan with a thick athletic frame that still carried the spring of a working animal even while bound. A tactical harness was cinched around his chest. The rope had been looped through it in a way that showed cruel competence, tight enough to lift him off the floor, not tight enough to snap anything quickly. His paws dangled, toes flexing occasionally as if testing the air for a place to stand. One ear was flattened back, the other twitching toward every sound. His eyes, dark, intelligent, furious, tracked the men with the kind of calculation that made Jack's throat tighten. That dog wasn't panicking. He was memorizing. Ranger pressed against Jack's left leg, not touching, just present like an anchor. Jack could feel the dog's quiet tension as a vibration in the air. Ranger's gaze locked onto the hanging K9 with something that wasn't quite empathy and wasn't quite rage, but lived somewhere between recognition. Two soldiers seeing each other across a battlefield nobody asked for. 5 men formed a loose circle around the hanging pair. They weren't kids playing tough. They were adults who had learned that the world often looks away. The youngest might have been late 20s, broad-shouldered in a way that came from gym work rather than labor, hair cropped short beneath a beanie, cheeks still smooth. He swung a wooden club in his hands with nervous bravado, as if he wanted the others to notice how hard he could pretend. A second man stood taller and thinner, a narrow face under a hood, stubble dark along his jaw, eyes too flat to be drunk. A third was stocky, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow, the kind of scar that sat like punctuation on a violent sentence. The fourth was older, maybe mid-40s, beard graying and untrimmed, hands gloved, posture relaxed in the way of someone who'd hurt people before and didn't need to prove it. The fifth closest to the beam had a heavy-set build and a work coat smeared with grease, a man who smelled of machine shops and resentment. He held a metal pipe like it belonged in his hand the way a tool did. They all wore the same expression, variations on a theme: ownership. Jack stayed behind a broken stack of pallets and rusted drums near the entrance, the kind of cover that was barely cover, but better than nothing. He didn't move like a hero entering a scene. He moved like a man reading a map. The old discipline slid over him again, not romantic, not glorious, just functional. Count weapons, measure distance, note exits, find the one thing they're protecting. His eyes flicked to the far wall, a battered pickup parked inside, tailgate down, boxes stacked beside it. He saw a coil of rope on the floor, a half-open toolbox, and a portable work light throwing harsh glare onto the concrete. These men hadn't come here on a whim. They were set up, waiting for someone. The woman's chin lifted a fraction as she heard a sound, his boot shifting on grit perhaps, or Ranger's tag lightly tapping his collar. Her eyes snapped toward the doorway. She saw darkness first, then Jack's outline, then the dog at his leg. Hope moved across her face and then got strangled back into caution. Good, Jack thought. Hope makes people stupid. Caution keeps them alive. One of the men followed her glance and turned. "Thought I heard something," he said. The youngest grinned too wide. "Maybe the boss sent company." The older, bearded man didn't laugh. He tilted his head, listening. He had the quiet confidence of someone who'd been trained, or at least mentored by someone who had. Jack disliked him immediately. That kind of man was the kind that didn't make mistakes unless he wanted you to see them. The stocky, scarred one spat onto the concrete. "Ain't nobody coming. Sheriff's bought, and the roads are dead. She's alone." The words slid under Jack's skin like a cold blade because they explained too much. Bought, roads dead, alone. That meant this wasn't just a random ambush. This was infrastructure. This was a system. The woman officer, Emma Hayes, Jack guessed, though he didn't know her name yet, spoke with a voice that tried to sound like authority despite being pulled tight by rope. "You're going to add assault on an officer to your list," she said, "and animal cruelty. That's a special kind of stupid." The youngest man lifted his club and made a mock bow. "Ma'am, he said, dripping sarcasm. "We're already stupid. You're late to the meeting." The hanging canine gave a low growl that rumbled in his chest. It wasn't loud. It was pure promise. The man with the pipe stepped closer, raising it, testing how much fear he could manufacture. The dog's body tensed, paws flexing, harness straining against the rope. He wanted to bite. The rope denied him. That denial was the point. Jack watched all of it with a strange, familiar stillness. His mind did not explode into rage the way it might have 10 years ago. It cooled. It narrowed. Somewhere deep inside him, the part that had once kicked down doors whispered, "You are here now." That same whisper carried an older truth. If you step in, you don't step out clean. Jack had spent years trying to become the kind of man who didn't step in. He'd chosen solitude and smallness like penance, and yet he was standing in the doorway of a warehouse watching a woman and her dog hang like ornaments on cruelty. The universe, apparently, had a sense of humor. Ranger's breathing changed, quiet, but sharper. Jack felt the dog's readiness in his bones. Ranger had not made the choice for him, but Ranger was reminding him what they were built for: protection, duty, the thing you do even when nobody claps. Jack's eyes swept the room again. The best chance was surprise. He was not armed with anything glamorous. A knife, his hands, his brain, Ranger. And the enemy had numbers and clubs and pipes. But numbers mean less when people are cocky. Cocky people watch the victim. They don't watch the shadows. The bearded older man walked to the hanging woman and leaned close, speaking softly, as if he were telling a bedtime story. "Boss will be here soon," he said. "You're going to stop acting tough when he arrives. Everyone does." She swallowed once, jaw set. "Tell your boss he's late," she said. "And tell him I'll still be here when he gets here." The man smiled without warmth. "We'll see." Jack could almost taste the woman's fear, not the fear of pain, but the fear of time. Waiting was its own torture. Waiting meant imagination. Jack had lived with enough imagination to know it could kill you without leaving a mark. He shifted his weight to move, but a tiny sound betrayed him. The leather of his jacket creaked, old and honest. The youngest man's head snapped toward the doorway. "Hey," he said, suddenly alert. "You hear that?" The circle tightened. Clubs rose. Pipes angled. The bearded man didn't panic. He lifted a hand, stilling the others. "Whoever's there," he called, voice calm. "You walked into the wrong building." Jack could have retreated then. He could have backed out into the trees and called for help. But the words "sheriff's bought" rang again. If law enforcement here was compromised, calling for help might just deliver Emma to her execution faster. Jack's mind moved with a brutal clarity. Either he acted now, or he walked away and lived with it forever. The hanging canine's eyes met Ranger's across the distance. In that look was a quiet message, almost comically blunt. Do something. Ranger's ears flicked forward as if agreeing. Jack's mouth tightened into something that was not a smile, but close enough. "All right," he whispered to Ranger, so softly it was more breath than sound. "Old rules." Ranger stayed, waiting for the hand signal. Jack eased his body back into the doorway's shadow, then picked up a pebble-sized chunk of concrete near his boot. He tossed it gently, not toward the men, but toward a pile of scrap metal near the far left wall. The piece clinked against steel with a sharp ring. All 5 men turned their heads instinctively. The youngest took 2 steps toward the sound. The man with the pipe followed, raising it. Their circle broke for a second, just a second, but seconds were currency, Jack understood. Ranger's eyes flicked to Jack's hand. Jack gave the smallest signal. Wait. He was about to choose his angle, his first target, his path to the rope, when the warehouse's side door groaned somewhere behind the men, an inward scrape as if someone outside had grabbed the handle. Every head snapped that way. The bearded man straightened. "That'll be him," he said, voice sharpening. The hanging woman's eyes widened, not with fear of pain now, but with the realization that the window was closing. Jack felt the world tilt into motion. He could not wait for the boss to enter. He had to move before the room filled with more bodies. Ranger's muscles coiled. Jack's knife settled into his palm, and in the thin blade of rooflight above them, Jack Mercer stepped out from the shadow toward the circle of men, choosing trouble like a man choosing oxygen. Jack moved before the room could fill with more bodies, not with the reckless charge of a movie hero, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned that survival is mostly timing. The warehouse smelled of cold iron and old oil, the kind of place where sound traveled in ugly ways, bouncing off beams and broken glass like it wanted to betray you. The 5 men had turned toward the side doors grown, their attention hooked by the promise of their boss. And that was the only gift Jack expected to get. He took it. He stepped out from the doorway shadow in a controlled glide, shoulders low, boots placing themselves where the grit wouldn't crunch too loudly. Ranger stayed half a breath behind him, a black and tan shape in the dim, spine level, eyes fixed, every ounce of him disciplined into silence. Jack didn't need words. The hand signal he gave was small, almost lazy, but Ranger's body answered like a prayer that had been practiced 1,000 times. Ranger slid left, cutting behind a stack of pallets and rusted drums, putting himself where he could see without being seen. The youngest guard broad shoulders, beanie, club swinging like he was trying to convince the world he mattered, took 2 steps toward the side door and called, "That you?" His voice cracked on the last word. Fear always did that. Jack noticed the tremor and filed it away. A shaky man with a weapon was dangerous, but also predictable. The bearded one older, graying, the calm-eyed commander of the pack, lifted his palm again to hush them. He was the real problem. Men like that didn't get loud. They got efficient. Jack waited for the exact moment the bearded man shifted his weight, just slightly, to angle for a better view of the side door. That shift created a blind spot in the circle, a thin seam in their attention. Jack slipped through it like a needle through cloth. He didn't go for the rope first. He went for the nearest weapon. The youngest guard turned back too late. Jack's left hand caught the club as it lifted, and his right forearm slammed into the man's wrist with a sharp, compact strike that stole strength rather than spilling blood. The club clattered to the concrete. Before the man could shout, Jack drove him backward into a leaning metal cabinet, pinning him with shoulder pressure and a grip on the collar that cut off leverage, not air. "Breathe," Jack murmured in his ear, almost kind, because panic made noise and noise brought reinforcements. The man froze, confused by the calm voice, by the fact that Jack wasn't screaming like the villains in his fantasies. Jack twisted the man's arm behind him, locked the elbow, and guided him down to his knees as if he were helping a drunk stand. A strip of rope lay coiled near a toolbox. Jack hooked it with his boot and kicked it toward Ranger's side of the room without looking. Ranger would understand. Ranger always did. One of the other guards swung a metal pipe toward Jack's head, the motion wide and emotional. Jack leaned inside it rather than away, letting the pipe whistle past his shoulder, then slammed his palm into the man's chest and used the man's forward momentum to spin him into the path of his own weapon. The man stumbled, shocked at his own clumsiness. Jack didn't punish him for it. He simply stole his balance and took him down with a hard shove into a pile of scrap that swallowed the impact with a metallic cough. The bearded leader barked, "Get him!" and the warehouse erupted into motion, boots scraping, clubs lifting, bodies tightening into a messy knot. That was what Jack wanted. A calm group was hard to break. A panicked group broke itself. Across the room, Emma Hayes hung by her wrists, eyes wide but unbroken, watching Jack move with the dawning comprehension of someone recognizing a language she hadn't heard in years. Her lips parted as if to speak. Then she stopped herself, remembering that sound could kill them. Even suspended, even aching, she chose discipline. Jack respected that more than he respected badges. Beside her, the K9 strained against his harness rope, teeth bared in a silent snarl that vibrated through his muzzle. He was 6 years old, all muscle and intent, black and tan, with a darker saddle down his back and the hard, polished look of a dog who had been praised for doing the right thing under stress. A thin line of drool shone at the corner of his mouth. Not fear, not weakness, just the body's honest response to adrenaline. His eyes tracked the weapons like he was building a map of where to bite first if the rope ever forgave him. Jack saw the harness patch in the slanting light and caught a name stitched there. Diesel. It hit him strangely, that name Diesel, like an old joke between people who'd seen too much machinery and too many fires. Ranger glanced at Diesel once, then back to the men, as if telling the younger dog, "Hold steady, you're not alone." The guards came in a staggered rush, 2 from the right, 1 from the left, one circling wide like he thought he was clever, and the bearded leader holding back just enough to observe. Jack chose the wide one first. Wide circling men were dangerous because they aimed for the rope, for the hostage, for the cheap win. Jack lunged toward the circler, grabbed a hanging chain with his left hand, and yanked it down hard. The chain rattled like thunder and snapped the man's attention upward for half a second. Jack used that half-second to close the distance, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs and pushing him into a support post. The man wheezed, pipe slipping from his glove. Jack let it fall. Then he stepped away, not finishing with anger, because finishing took time, and time was the real enemy. Ranger appeared in the edge of Jack's vision, low to the ground, moving behind 2 guards who had surged too far forward. Ranger did not leap like a movie wolf. He did something smarter. He bumped a loose metal pan with his hip, making it skitter across the concrete with a sudden shriek. One guard flinched and turned instinctively toward the noise, raising his club in the wrong direction. That flinch opened the guard's back. Jack swept in, hooked the man's ankle with his boot, and sent him down. The club slid away. Jack pinned the man's wrist with his knee, twisted the club out of reach, and shoved him into the shadow behind a drum. No gore, no theatrics, just removal. Emma's breath shook once. Whether from pain or disbelief, Jack couldn't tell. The bearded leader advanced now, pipe held not high but low, eyes measuring Jack's posture like he was reading a manual. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, voice tight with anger that couldn't find a clean place to land. Jack didn't answer. Names were for later, if later existed. The bearded man feinted left, then drove in, aiming for Jack's midsection. Jack caught the pipe with both hands, not stopping it, dead guiding it. He redirected the strike into an empty swing, stepped inside the man's reach, and shoved his forearm under the man's chin, not to crush, but to tilt the head back and steal the eyes. The bearded man's balance shifted. Jack drove a knee into the man's thigh, hard enough to buckle without breaking. The leader went down with a grunt that tried to be silent and failed. Jack's knife stayed in his hand, unused. He wasn't here to carve. He was here to end the threat. Ranger, efficient as fate, dragged the kicked rope coil closer with his teeth and dropped it at Jack's feet like an offering. Jack used it to bind the bearded man's wrists quickly, tight and neat, then shoved him behind the metal cabinet with the first guard. 2 threats neutralized. 3 remaining. The last 3 didn't have the leader's control. They surged, desperate now, angry that their power story was falling apart. One swung a club toward Ranger. Jack's chest tightened, then Ranger moved, not biting, not even growling, but sliding back and letting the club smash into a drum with a hollow clang. The guard's hands stung, his grip loosened. Diesel, hanging beside Emma, saw it and thrashed once, rope creaking, as if furious at being forced to watch. Emma's eyes locked on Jack again, and in that look Jack read something that hurt in a familiar way. "Please don't die. Not because I can't handle this. Because I've already handled too much death." Jack didn't let himself feel it fully. Feeling could wait. He took the 3rd guard down with a shoulder throw into the scrap pile, then pivoted to the 4th, using the man's forward rush against him. An elbow to the forearm, a twist, a shove, and the pipe slipped free and clattered away like a confession. The 5th guard hesitated, eyes darting to the side door again, as if salvation might walk in at any moment. That hesitation was mercy. Jack crossed the distance, grabbed the man's jacket front, and slammed him into the wall just hard enough to make him drop his club. "Stay down," Jack said, voice low, command threaded with a weary kindness that the man didn't deserve. But Jack gave anyway, because cruelty was contagious and Jack refused to carry it home. Then Jack turned, and everything in him narrowed to the beam above Emma. He moved to her first, not because she was more important than Diesel, but because she would be the one to speak, to call, to remember. Her wrists were raw, her shoulders trembling from the strain. Up close, Jack saw the stubborn set of her mouth, the way pain had carved lines at the corners of her eyes but hadn't conquered them. She was tall, around 5'8", athletic without show, the kind of strength built from long shifts and too many nights where kindness got you hurt. Her face held a calm defiance that had likely been forged by betrayal at some point. Jack had met that look in mirrors before. "Don't move," Jack whispered, and when she nodded, he slid his knife carefully against the rope above her binding point. He didn't saw wildly. He supported her weight with one arm, took the rope with the other, and cut in a single controlled draw. Emma dropped into his hold, a sharp gasp escaping despite her effort. Jack lowered her to the concrete, and she landed on her knees, head bowed for 1 second as if praying, then lifted her face again. "Thank you," she breathed, and the words came out thin and furious, like gratitude mixed with shame for needing help. Jack didn't respond. He was already at Diesel. The dog's eyes widened as Jack approached, not fear anticipation. Jack pressed a steadying hand against Diesel's harness, felt the dog's heart hammering like a trapped engine, and spoke softly. "Easy, Diesel." The name seemed to settle the dog's body by a fraction, as if hearing it reminded him of identity, of training, of who he was beyond the rope. Jack cut the rope while taking Diesel's weight, then lowered him down. Diesel hit the floor with a controlled thump, legs wobbling for half a breath before they found their strength. He shook once, hard, from shoulders to tail, like a warrior shedding a curse, then stepped immediately to Emma's side, pressing his body against her shin as if anchoring her to the world. Ranger approached, slow and respectful, head slightly lowered, not submissive, but acknowledging another working dog's dignity. Diesel sniffed Ranger once, quick and intense, then let out a quiet huff that sounded almost like a laugh. Two dogs, both offended by the idea of helplessness, sharing a moment of wordless agreement, never again. Emma flexed her fingers behind her back, wincing, then looked up at Jack with eyes that were too clear for someone who'd just been hanging from a beam. "They said the sheriff was bought," she whispered, voice steadying. "They're waiting for their boss." Jack's gaze flicked to the side door, then to the men groaning in the shadows, then to the warehouse's broken windows where winter stared in. "Then we don't wait," he said, finally giving her something like an answer. Emma got to her feet, swaying once, and squared her shoulders like she was putting her soul back into uniform. Diesel and Ranger stood on either side of them, both dogs shivering from cold and strain, both sets of eyes burning with the particular fire of creatures who had been treated as objects and decided, unanimously, to become weapons of loyalty instead. Jack didn't celebrate. He didn't exhale relief yet. He simply turned his head, listened for the next sound, and held up one hand signal for quiet, for move, for the old promise right enough and silent. And the first headlights swept across the warehouse floor like a searchlight from an old war movie, and for a split second the dust in the air turned into drifting sparks. Then the engine noise hit 2 trucks, maybe 3, tires crunching over gravel outside, doors slamming with the casual confidence of men arriving to finish a meal. Jack didn't need to see the reinforcements to feel them. The sound carried a certainty. These weren't confused locals who'd wandered into trouble. They were a system, arriving on schedule. Emma Hayes rose to her feet with a grimace, rolling her shoulders as if trying to reattach them to her body. Her wrists were red and swollen where rope had cut the skin, but her eyes were clear, and the clarity was the dangerous part. Clarity meant she understood the stakes. Diesel pressed against her shin, steadying her like a living brace while Ranger hovered near Jack, head low, scanning the warehouse doors as if he could smell time itself running out. Jack raised one finger quiet and pointed toward the back of the building where a broken service corridor led to an old loading bay. It wasn't a plan so much as a direction. Move before they become a crowd. They slipped between rusted machines and stacks of warped lumber, stepping over old cables like snakes that had died mid-crawl. Jack moved first, not because he wanted to lead, but because he knew how to absorb the first mistake. Emma followed, favoring her right shoulder. She didn't complain. People like Emma didn't complain. They stored pain in their ribs and paid it off later in private. "Back door," Jack murmured, voice barely above breath. She nodded once. "My radio," she whispered. "They took it." The sentence was clipped, professional information, not self-pity. It told Jack something else, too. She had already scanned her losses and started thinking in resources. That kind of mind didn't crack easily. It just bent until it became sharp. Diesel's nails clicked softly on concrete. Jack winced at the sound and adjusted their route to patches of old rubber matting near the loading area. Ranger, ever the tactician, placed his paws where Jack placed his boots, matching the rhythm like a shadow with a heartbeat. Behind them, voices rose, men calling to each other, a laugh, then the sharper tone of someone giving orders. A flashlight beam cut across the far wall, jittering as its owner moved. Jack didn't look back. Looking back wasted distance. They reached the loading bay where the big door had been ripped halfway off its tracks years ago. Cold air poured through the gap like a living thing. Outside, the forest waited, black and white and indifferent. Snow covered everything in a clean sheet that lied convincingly about how easy it was to disappear. Jack knew better. Snow didn't hide tracks. It wrote them in bold. "We go wide," Jack said, and for the first time Emma heard the old cadence in his voice, the tone of a man used to making decisions that other people lived or died by. He wasn't barking orders. He was building a path. No straight lines. Emma swallowed, nodded again. She placed a hand on Diesel's harness, grounding herself. "My K9 is trained to track," she whispered, then corrected herself automatically because Diesel wasn't equipment. "Diesel can cover our rear." Diesel's ears flicked at his name, and he huffed once as if offended by the idea of being anything other than essential. Ranger angled his head toward Diesel, then back to the trees, as if saying, "Good, do your job." Jack led them into the tree line, choosing a route that wasn't the obvious trail but a shallow gully where old runoff had carved a narrow dip. Tracks would still show, but the gully offered broken sight lines. The night was brutally bright in places. Snow reflected moonlight so hard it felt like walking under a giant lamp. Jack kept them under branches where shadows pooled. It was slow, careful movement, exactly the kind of movement that kept you alive and made you feel like you were aging by the minute. 20 yards into the trees, Emma stumbled once, catching herself on a trunk. Jack's hand shot out to steady her, then pulled back as soon as she was upright, help given, dignity preserved. "You good?" he asked. She exhaled sharply. "I'm good," she lied. Then, because she couldn't tolerate lying in the middle of a fight, she added, "I can move." That was what mattered. Behind them, the warehouse door slammed open. Voices spilled into the night. "They're gone!" one yelled. Another answered with profanity. A flashlight beam stabbed the darkness, sweeping back and forth like an angry eye. Jack's chest tightened, not with panic, but with that old familiarity. Pursuit. He hated it. Not because he couldn't handle it, but because pursuit reminded him of every time he'd run with someone bleeding beside him, every time he'd promised he'd get them out and then learned promises didn't always win. Emma's breathing was tight, controlled. Diesel stayed close to her, occasionally glancing back, reading the air. Ranger did the same, but Ranger's reading went deeper. He seemed to sense where the forest would funnel sound and where it would swallow it. Jack stopped at the edge of a frozen creek bed and crouched. He found a thin strip of icy water still moving beneath a crust. the kind of water that made noise if you stepped wrong. He pointed. Down. Follow the creek line. It breaks tracks. Emma looked at the ice, then at him. You know this area, she said. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded once. He didn't explain that he'd chosen Pine Hollow because it had enough wilderness to disappear into, and that disappearance required knowing every bend and hollow like it was a vein in your own wrist. They moved along the creek bed, careful, boots finding frozen stones, dogs stepping with uncanny precision. For 5 minutes, it worked. The forest softened. The sounds behind them faded. Emma's shoulders loosened a fraction. Then her phone buzzed, short, sharp, startling. She jerked as if shocked by electricity. Jack's eyes snapped to her hand. You have service? He whispered. Barely, she said, already pulling the device out with fingers that trembled from cold and adrenaline. The screen glowed against her face like a confession. I have a backup app, she said, voice low. I can ping my unit. County dispatch, too. Jack's jaw clenched at the word county. Still, help was help. Do it, he said, though something in him already didn't like the idea. Emma typed quickly, breath fogging over the screen. She sent a short message. Location, direction, need immediate extraction. Diesel watched her fingers, then looked back into the trees, ears pricked. Ranger's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Jack felt it too, like the forest had stiffened. Less than a minute after Emma hit send, an engine revved somewhere ahead, not behind. Ahead. Jack froze. He raised a fist stop. Emma's eyes widened, not understanding yet. Then headlights flickered through the trunks in front of them, sweeping across branches. A truck was moving on an old logging road that shouldn't have been used in winter. The beam searched with purpose, not luck. Jack's stomach dropped in a way he hadn't felt since the bad days overseas. No, Emma whispered. That's not possible. Diesel growled quietly. Ranger's body went rigid, then angled left, offering a route that was not the creek line. Jack grabbed Emma's sleeve and pulled her after Ranger, dragging them up a bank into thicker brush. They hit the ground behind a fallen log as the truck rolled past on the logging road, slow, predatory. Men rode in the bed, silhouettes with rifles or pipes, hard to tell in the glare. One of them laughed, a low sound that didn't belong in nature. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes shining with fury and disbelief. Jack leaned close. How did they get ahead? He whispered. Emma swallowed, eyes darting to her phone. I just sent the ping. She didn't say the rest, but it hung between them like frost. Someone was listening. Not someone might be. Someone was. They waited until the truck's sound faded. Jack didn't relax. He moved them again, faster now, cutting through a stand of young firs where branches slapped their jackets and snow dumped down their collars in cold handfuls. Emma's breaths came shorter. Diesel stayed with her, occasionally bumping her leg when her balance wavered, small corrections. A dog acting like a partner, not property. Ranger ranged ahead, stopping at intervals to listen, then choosing a direction with the quiet authority of a creature born to navigate threats. After 10 minutes, Jack spotted an old timber yard clearing, an abandoned patch of cut logs half buried in snow, with rusted equipment silhouettes and a skeletal crane arm reaching into the night like a question mark. It was a bad place to be seen, but a good place to disappear for a heartbeat. Jack guided them into the shadow of a stacked log pile, crouching low. Emma's hands were shaking now, not from fear alone, but from the awful mathematics of betrayal. My unit should be coming, she whispered. They should be. I know my guys. Her voice cracked on the last word. Jack studied her profile in the moonlight. The freckles on her nose looked like flecks of ash. Her mouth tightened into a line that held back too much emotion. She was the kind of woman who had probably believed in procedure the way some people believed in God. Not because it was comforting, but because it was supposed to work. When procedure failed, it didn't just endanger you, it humiliated your faith. Jack kept his own face still, but inside, something old stirred. A bitter recognition. Systems failed. People failed. The only thing you could trust was the next step you controlled. Emma lifted the radio mic cord that still hung from her collar. Empty, useless. "I can try a different frequency," she said, almost pleading with the idea of rescue. Jack hesitated. He didn't want to crush her hope, but he also refused to feed her a lie. "Try," he said, "but keep it short." Emma nodded and spoke softly into the mic, giving a new coordinate this time, a rough one, not exact. "Unit 1, this is Officer Hayes. Need immediate—" She stopped, listening. Static. Nothing. Then, far off to their right, an engine started, not close, but close enough to turn her blood cold. Jack saw her expression shift, shock giving way to horror. "They're coming again," she whispered. "They heard me." Jack took the mic from her gently and clicked it off. He didn't scold. He didn't blame. Blame was a luxury. "Okay," he said, voice low, steady, the tone he used when everything went sideways but you still had to move. "No more broadcasting, not yet." Emma stared at him as if he'd slapped her, then as if she understood he was saving her. "Someone in dispatch," she breathed, "or in my chain." The thought looked like it hurt her physically. Jack nodded once. "Could be," he said. "Or someone has access to what you're sending." Diesel's ears swiveled, and he let out a soft whine, not fear, but frustration at being trapped in human betrayal. Ranger pressed his shoulder briefly against Jack's leg, grounding him. A sound drifted through the trees, the distant snap of a branch, then another. Men moving on foot now. The hunt had changed from vehicles to boots. Jack leaned toward Emma, speaking so quietly the words barely existed. "We're going to move again," he said. "We don't head to town. We don't head to your station. We head where I can control the ground." Emma's eyes searched his face. "Where?" she asked. Jack looked into the forest, into the dark shapes he knew like old friends and old enemies. "Somewhere only me and Ranger know," he said. Emma swallowed hard. Trust was a bridge, and she had just watched her own bridge collapse. But she nodded, because the alternative was dying with her faith still in her hands. Jack rose first, signaling both dogs with a small motion. Ranger moved silently into the trees. Diesel stayed close to Emma, ready to catch her if her knees failed. Behind them, voices called out, and a flashlight beam swept the timber yard like a tongue tasting the air. Jack and Emma slipped away into the winter, 4 shadows among a million white ones. And the cruel thing about betrayal was that it traveled faster than hope. Snow thickened, as if the forest had decided to close its own curtains. The pines swallowed the last trace of the timber yard behind them, and even the moonlight seemed to hesitate, dulled by cloud and falling white. Jack Mercer didn't run like a man fleeing. He ran like a man relocating a fight. Every choice he made had a shape. Avoid straight lines, break sight, control sound, let the land do half the work. Ranger moved ahead with the quiet certainty of a creature who understood that forests had rules older than men. Diesel stayed pressed to Emma Hayes, shoulder brushing her thigh when her step faltered, the way a good working dog offered both support and a reminder. "Keep moving. You're not alone." Emma's breath rasped in her throat, sharp from cold and strain. Her wrists hurt, her shoulders burned. But worse than pain was the gnawing thought that kept trying to climb her spine. Someone was steering the hunters like they had a leash on her. Jack stopped them in a pocket of thick fir where branches hung low, heavy with snow. The air smelled clean pine resin and frozen soil, but the clean smell couldn't scrub away dread. He crouched, palm raised. "Halt!" Ranger froze instantly, ears swiveling. Diesel mirrored him, body angled between Emma and the open corridor of trees they'd just crossed. Emma leaned a hand against a trunk and tried to quiet her breathing. Jack watched her face in the dim, reading the way her eyes moved fast, searching, trying to solve betrayal like it was a puzzle you could outthink. "They're not guessing," Jack said, voice low enough that it could have been mistaken for wind. "They're receiving." Emma's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "From my phone?" she whispered. Her tone held a stubborn disbelief, like the truth was a stone she didn't want to pick up because it would be too heavy. Jack didn't soften what he knew. Softness killed. "Pattern's too clean," he said. "First ping, truck ahead. Second call, engine starts within minutes. That's not luck. That's a leak." Emma's jaw tightened, the freckles across her nose fading into the cold pallor of winter. Her auburn hair, half loose now, had frost clinging to strands near her temple. She looked like someone carved out of stubbornness and sleepless nights. "My unit has protocols," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Dispatch logs everything. Access is limited." Jack's eyes stayed steady. "Access is never as limited as people think," he replied, and his voice carried the weight of a memory he didn't share. Radios rerouted, friends exposed, coordinates sold for cheap. Emma stared at him, and he could see the moment the idea cracked open inside her. Not just the possibility of an outsider intercepting, something uglier, the possibility of a badge being used as a knife. "An insider," she said, and the words sounded like they cut her mouth on the way out. Jack nodded once. "Yeah," he said, "there's a mole." Emma's shoulders sagged for half a second, not from fatigue but from grief. Grief for the naive part of her that had still believed the system would come running. Then she straightened again, because she was still a cop, still a fighter, and because denial was a luxury she could no longer afford. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Jack didn't answer immediately. He scanned the woods, listened. The forest made a certain quiet when men were nearby, a quiet like animals had stepped away from the script. He heard it now, faint, a hush that wasn't natural. Somewhere behind them, far off, a branch snapped. Then silence again. Jack felt the hunt adjusting, shifting into smaller shapes. "You turn off everything that talks," he said at last. "Phone, location, emergency beacon, Bluetooth, all of it." Emma's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat she looked almost offended, like he'd asked her to tear off her badge and throw it into the snow. Her voice came tight. "If I go dark, they can't find me," she said, trying to convince herself it was good. "But my people can't either." Jack's expression didn't change, but his gaze softened by a hair. "Your people aren't coming," he said quietly. "Not yet. Not while the leak exists." Emma's face tightened, pain flashing there. She hated the truth because it made her feel helpless. But she also respected it because it was honest. She pulled her phone out, hands shaking, screen lighting her face like a small blue moon. Jack watched her fingers move through settings with the quick competence of someone who had done tech training, but he also saw the tremor in the knuckles. Turning off location wasn't just a step. It was a surrender of the idea that safety arrived on schedule. Emma clicked off the GPS, then cell data. Then she powered the device down entirely and shoved it into an inner pocket like it was a venomous insect. "Done," she whispered. Diesel huffed once, a sound that might have been relief. Ranger's tail gave a minimal sweep as if approving. Jack didn't let them linger. "We move," he said. "Now." Emma tried to set the pace, but her body was reaching its argument with her will. Rope burn made her wrists throb. The strain from hanging had left her shoulder joints screaming every time she lifted an arm. Jack noticed without making a show of it. He adjusted their route to avoid steep climbs, choosing a path that seemed random to anyone else but was a thread Jack had tied to this land over months. Deer trails, shallow gullies, a line of boulders that blocked wind. Ranger ran point, pausing every so often to look back, checking on the group like a sergeant checking a squad. Diesel stayed at Emma's side, occasionally glancing toward Jack for cues, the way trained dogs did, eyes asking, "What now?" Jack felt something strange tighten in his chest. He'd lived with Ranger for years, had depended on him like you depended on your own legs. Seeing Diesel work with Emma, the same bond, the same loyalty made Jack remember what he'd tried to forget, that partnership was not weakness, it was strength multiplied. The forest grew denser, snow deepened, the world narrowed into breath and footfall and the soft whisper of branches. Then, after a long stretch that felt like it lasted an hour but might have been 15 minutes, Jack angled toward a cluster of rocks that rose from the hillside like the spine of a buried beast. The stone was dark, wet in places where meltwater had frozen again, and it looked like nothing special, just another outcrop in an endless forest. Emma's eyes flicked over it and found nothing. "Here?" she asked. Jack didn't answer with words. He crouched, brushed aside snow with his gloved hands, and revealed a shallow depression behind a fallen slab. It was not a cave mouth anyone would notice unless they were hunting specifically for it. The entrance was half hidden by a curtain of dead brush Jack had arranged with care, and by the natural shadow cast by the rock. Ranger stepped forward first, sniffing, then slipped inside without hesitation. Diesel hesitated a fraction, then followed, trusting Ranger's confidence more than his own unfamiliarity. Emma stared, disbelief mixing with weary gratitude. "You built this?" she whispered. Jack's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a grimace. "Found it," he said. "Made it usable." Emma ducked and crawled in behind the dogs. Jack followed last, because the last man saw what was behind. Inside, the air changed. It wasn't warm, not truly, but it was sheltered. The wind couldn't reach them here, and the silence was thicker, safer. The space was a rock hollow that widened into a small chamber, maybe 10 feet across, with a low ceiling that forced you to stay humble. A tarp had been stretched along one wall to block drafts. A few flat stones formed a crude platform for sleeping. In a corner, a small cache box sat sealed water purification tablets, a flashlight, bandages, a compact camp stove with fuel canisters. Nothing luxurious. Everything intentional. Emma looked around with the stunned expression of someone realizing this man had been preparing for the world to betray him long before it actually did. Jack set his pack down and listened again. The outside world was muffled now, turned down like a cruel radio. He finally exhaled, not relief, but the first fraction of control he'd had since stepping into the warehouse. Ranger settled near the entrance, body angled outward, ears alert. Diesel lay close to Emma, still trembling from cold and the strain of being suspended, but his eyes never closed fully. Emma sank onto the flat stones, then immediately winced as her shoulder protested. Jack crouched and pulled out the bandage kit from his cache. "Give me your arm," he said. Emma's pride flared in her eyes, then got swallowed by exhaustion. She extended her wrists first. The rope burns were angry red, skin rubbed raw. Jack's hands were steady as he cleaned them with a small, antiseptic wipe. His touch wasn't gentle in a sentimental way. It was careful in a competent way. That kind of care felt safer than tenderness. Emma watched him work, studying his face as if she was building a profile. She saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the old scar near his knuckle, the way his expression stayed controlled even while his jaw tightened now and then, like anger lived in him but obeyed rules. "You're military," she said softly. Jack didn't look up. "Was," he replied. "Special operations." Emma's eyes narrowed. "That's why you moved like that," she murmured, half to herself. "That's why you didn't panic." Jack's mouth tightened. "Panic doesn't help," he said. Emma flexed her fingers, testing circulation. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small roll of medical tape she'd somehow kept. "Your hand," she said, noticing a scrape along his knuckles, likely from slamming someone into metal. Jack started to wave it off, but the dog shifted, and Diesel's gaze lifted to him like a direct order. "Sit." Jack exhaled through his nose, a silent laugh at being bossed around by a younger K9. "Fine," he said. Emma leaned closer, her movements slower now, and carefully taped the scrape after cleaning it with a wipe. Her hands were cold, but steady. She worked like someone who had patched up colleagues in the field, someone who understood that keeping people functional was its own form of mercy. Jack watched her in return. For a cop, she wasn't noisy. She didn't posture. There was a heaviness in her restraint, the kind that came from having learned the hard way that being underestimated could be useful. While Emma worked on Jack's hand, Jack turned his attention to Diesel. The canine's harness had rubbed the fur under his chest raw where the rope had tightened. Jack unbuckled the harness slowly, careful not to startle the dog, then cleaned the irritated skin and wrapped a soft cloth around the worst spot. Diesel held still, eyes on Jack, as if he'd decided Jack was safe but still wanted to verify. Ranger watched from the entrance, blinking slowly, approving the triage like a senior medic. When Jack finished, Diesel shook once, then leaned his head briefly into Jack's palm, one quick press, a silent thank you that made Jack's throat tighten in a way he didn't like. Emma saw it. She didn't comment. She just sat back and let the small warmth of cooperation settle into the chamber like embers. Outside, a distant shout floated through the trees, muffled by rock. Then another. The hunters were still searching, still confident their map would lead them to prey. They didn't know the signal had died. They didn't know the prey had stopped being prey. Jack sat back against the stone wall, listening to the forest's breath through the narrow entrance. Emma, exhausted, rested her head briefly against the rock and closed her eyes for 2 seconds of surrender before opening them again. "I can't call anyone," she whispered, voice small and furious. Jack stared at the darkness beyond the entrance. "Not yet," he said. "Right now, we survive. Then we hunt." Emma's eyes met his in the dim. She had lost trust in her system in a single night. But in this rock hollow, with 2 dogs guarding and a man who had already saved her once, she felt something else taking root. A new kind of trust, smaller, harder earned, built one choice at a time. Ranger huffed softly, as if amused by the dramatic humans. Diesel's ears flicked, and he scooted closer to Emma's boot, protective even while half drowsy. Jack let the silence hold them. No speeches, no promises. Just the steady fact that they were alive, together, and hidden for now. Morning didn't arrive like hope. It arrived like paperwork, quiet, unavoidable, and cold enough to sting. The sky beyond the rock hollow was a dull sheet of pewter, and the wind had shifted in the night, packing fresh snow into every footprint they'd left yesterday, as if the forest itself had decided to erase evidence. Jack Mercer sat with his back against stone, eyes open long before dawn, listening to the world. He had slept in fragments the way men with old wars slept, 10 minutes of darkness, then waking to check if silence still meant safety. Ranger dozed near the entrance, head on his paws, one ear constantly twitching, as if even his dreams were patrolling. Diesel lay curled against Emma's boots, his muzzle tucked under his tail for warmth, but his eyes opened whenever Jack moved, ready to become sharp again in a heartbeat. Emma Hayes had managed a shallow sleep too. When she woke, she didn't stretch like an ordinary person. She flexed her fingers, tested her shoulder, assessed pain like a technician checking instruments. Her freckles looked more pronounced against the winter-pale skin of her face. Her auburn hair had dried into messy strands that framed eyes that were both tired and hungry for answers. In the dim of the hollow, she looked less like a uniform and more like a woman who had been asked to believe in a system and had watched it flinch. "No service," she said quietly, after checking her phone without powering it fully on. "Which is what we want." Jack nodded. "Which is what we need," he corrected, not to be cruel, but because need was more reliable than want. Emma's gaze held on him. "If I can't call my station," she said, "and county is compromised, we're alone." Jack's mouth tightened. Alone had been his lifestyle. Now it was a tactical problem involving 3 other lives. He looked at Diesel's harness, at Ranger's scarred ear, at Emma's raw wrists. "We're not alone," he said, glancing at the dogs. "We're just outnumbered." That was when Emma finally let the truth settle into her bones, and when it didn't collapse her. It hardened her. She exhaled a slow breath. "Then we can't keep running," she said. Jack's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of approval. She was catching on. Running was what prey did. "Exactly," Jack replied. "We stop being the trail." He pulled his small cash box closer and opened it. Inside were items that looked boring to a civilian and looked like a toolbox to someone who had spent years improvising. Paracord, a compact roll of wire, a couple of carabiners, a small pry bar, 2 chemical heat packs, a folding saw, and a cheap handheld radio he'd bought years ago at a pawn shop, more for weather than conversation. Emma's eyes narrowed on the radio. "That thing work?" she asked. Jack turned it in his hands. "Works enough," he said, "and it's not tied to your department." Emma understood the difference immediately. Her posture shifted, less despair, more calculation. Jack unrolled a map he'd drawn by hand on waterproof paper. It wasn't pretty. It was accurate. Ridge lines, creek beds, old logging roads that no longer appeared on county maps, a few X marks where he'd stashed supplies or noted hazards. "You've been planning for this?" Emma said, softly. There was no accusation in her voice, just wonder mixed with a little sadness. Jack shrugged. "I've been planning to not need anyone," he said. "Same thing." Emma almost smiled, then didn't. "Okay," she said. "Where do we turn them?" Jack pointed to a narrow stretch of forest 2 miles south, where a dried ravine ran between 2 ridges. "Here," he said. "Old wash. Steep sides. One way in, one way out if you don't know the cut-through." Emma traced the line with a finger. "It funnels them," she murmured. "Choke point." Jack nodded. "And sound carries. They'll think we're close." Emma's eyes lifted. "But we'll be controlling the edges," she said, finishing the thought. Her voice gained a new steadiness, the steadiness of someone building a plan out of ruin. Jack glanced at her shoulder. "Can you handle movement?" he asked. Emma rotated her arm slowly. Pain flashed across her face like a shadow. "I can handle necessary," she said. Jack accepted that. Necessary was all anyone ever truly had. He turned to the dogs. Ranger stood when Jack looked at him, as if attention was a command. Diesel rose too, shaking once, then stepping to Emma's side like a stitched-on guardian. Jack crouched and took Ranger's face gently between both hands. The dog's eyes were dark, intelligent, patient. "We're going to work," Jack whispered. Ranger's tail gave one low sweep. The dog understood work. Diesel's ears perked as Jack turned toward him. Emma laid a hand on Diesel's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle beneath fur. "He's trained for controlled decoy," she said, reading Jack's unspoken concern. "He can draw without breaking." Jack nodded, but he didn't fully relax. Controlled decoy was a beautiful phrase for a dangerous job. Still, he trusted the dog. He also trusted Emma to know when to pull her partner back. They left the rock hollow in a staggered sequence. Ranger first to scent check, then Jack, then Emma with Diesel, moving slow and careful so their departure didn't become obvious to any eyes watching from afar. The forest had that strange hush again, the hush that suggested men were out there somewhere, searching, listening. Jack didn't let Emma look behind. Looking behind was an emotional habit. Forward was survival. By mid-morning, they reached the dried ravine. It was a wound in the earth, half filled with snow, sides lined with brittle brush and scattered boulders. Fallen trees lay across parts of it like old bones. Jack stepped down into it and tested the snow crust with his boot. Beneath the crust was compacted ice and leaf litter, slick and treacherous if you didn't expect it. Perfect. Emma crouched beside him, scanning sight lines like she'd been taught. Angles, cover, dead zones. Her eyes were hazel green in this light, and they had that particular law enforcement focus, practical, alert, a mind that could isolate a threat in chaos. "We can put the first trap here," she said, pointing to a section where the ravine narrowed and the snow looked deceptively smooth. Jack nodded. "Pit," he said. "Not deep enough to kill, deep enough to break momentum." He moved with quick competence now, the old him rising, not the violent part, but the craft part. He used the folding saw to cut thin branches, laid them over a shallow hole where the ravine dipped, then covered them with a layer of snow and leaf debris. It was a simple trap. The power was in its placement. Emma watched, then started building her own addition. A secondary snare line using the wire and carabiners, positioned so if someone avoided the pit by stepping to the side, they'd hit the snare, jerked off balance, forced to expose their hands or drop their weapon. "You've done this," Jack said, not accusing, recognizing. Emma's mouth tightened. "My father was a hunter," she answered, "before he drank, before my mother left." There it was, the event that had shaped her. A home where safety could vanish without warning. It explained her discipline, her drive to control the uncontrollable. Jack didn't comment further. He just kept working. They set 3 traps in a line, each designed to herd rather than destroy. Pit, snare, slick ice fall. The goal wasn't to slaughter. The goal was to thin, disarm, and create confusion. Jack's mind moved like a chess player. Emma's mind moved like a cop who'd learned that criminals relied on habit. Together they made a plan that felt almost unfair. The dogs took their roles as if they'd signed a contract. Ranger moved along the ravine edge, sniffing for side paths the hunters might take, marking possible flanks with a low huff. Diesel practiced short bursts of motion dash out, bark once, retreat each time returning to Emma's knee without needing a command. The coordination was eerie, beautiful, and a little funny, because even in terror dogs found a way to make work look like an insult to fear. At one point, Diesel paused, looked at Ranger, and sneezed sharply, an actual sneeze, not a tactic, then gave a huffy look as if embarrassed. Ranger's ears flicked, and Jack could have sworn the older dog's eyes softened in amusement. Emma, watching, let out a short laugh that surprised her. It came out rough, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. Jack didn't tease her. He just allowed the moment to exist, because humor was not denial. It was oxygen. By late afternoon, they were positioned. Jack on the left ridge line with Ranger, Emma on the right with Diesel, both with clear sight to the ravine's center. They had no firearms yet, only improvised tools and the weapons they could take. Emma's jaw set as she considered that. "If they have guns," she began. "Then we don't give them clean shots," Jack finished. He pointed to the brush and the boulders. "We make them look up. We make them slip. We make them panic." Emma nodded slowly. "And the lure?" she asked. Jack's eyes went to the handheld radio in his pocket. "The lure is what got us hunted," he said, "so we use it back." Emma's throat tightened. "You want me to broadcast," she said, understanding instantly. And the idea tasted like poison because it meant trusting the very channel that had betrayed her. Jack shook his head. "Not your channels," he said. "Mine." He held up the cheap handheld radio. "Different frequency, short burst, a false coordinate. Something that sounds like you but isn't trackable the same way." Emma frowned. "They're not tracking frequency," she whispered. "They're tracking information." Jack nodded. "Exactly." He tapped the map again, pointing to a clearing 2 miles north far from the ravine. "We tell the radio we're there," he said, "but we set our trap here." Emma's eyes sharpened. "They'll surge," she said, "because they think we're scared and running." Jack's mouth tightened. "And because someone is eager to deliver you," he added. The thought sat between them like a dead animal. Emma's nostrils flared, anger blooming under her skin. "Okay," she said, voice low. "Let's feed the monster." Jack listened a moment, making sure the wind wouldn't carry his voice too far, then keyed the handheld radio. He altered his tone subtly, roughened it, clipped it, made it sound like a stressed man trying not to be heard. "Need pickup," he murmured. 2 miles north of the old timber yard. Hurry." He released the button. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the forest itself had heard the lie and decided whether to bless it. Emma's eyes closed for a brief second. "If they come," she whispered. Jack glanced at Ranger. The dog's posture was still, ready, grounded. Then Jack looked at Diesel, who stood like a statue at Emma's knee, eyes fixed down the ravine. "They'll come," Jack said. "Predators always come to easy food." Emma breathed in, and the breath became resolve. "Then we make it not easy," she replied. The sun sank behind the ridge, turning the snow a bruised gray. The ravine became a throat of shadow. Jack's muscles loosened into readiness, the state between stillness and violence. Ranger's ears tracked the faintest sound. Diesel's body tensed, waiting for his cue to become the decoy, the spark that would light the trap. Somewhere in the forest, far off, an engine started. Then another. Jack didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply shifted his weight, set his hand on his knife, and let the old skills and the new courage meet in the same place. The decision to stop being hunted and start hunting back. The first man entered the ravine like he owned it, and that arrogance was the opening note of his downfall. Night had settled fully now, turning the world into gradients of dark and white. Snow reflected the weak sky glow, enough to outline bodies, but not enough to show intentions. Jack Mercer lay motionless on the left ridgeline, half buried behind brush and rock. His breath slowed until it barely fogged. Ranger crouched beside him, black and tan coat blending into shadow, eyes bright as coals. Across the ravine, Emma Hayes held her position behind a boulder and a curtain of dead branches. Diesel pressed against her knee like a living brace. Emma's wrists were taped, her shoulders stiff, but her focus was razor clean. Pain was just background noise now. Betrayal had burned away the soft parts. Below them the ravine waited, narrow, slick, and armed with the quiet lies they'd built into the snow. A faint crunch. Another. Then the soft murmur of voices, low and confident, the way men spoke when they believed the prey was tired and cornered. Jack watched their silhouettes appear in staggered intervals, 3 in front, spaced like they'd learned caution at least once in their lives, with 2 more trailing, scanning the ridge lines with flashlights that they tried to keep low. They were not the same 5 guards from the warehouse. These were reinforcements hired muscle, the kind that drifted between job sites and violence depending on what paid better. The lead man was tall and narrow-shouldered, wearing a dark parka with the hood up, beard scruff catching frost along his chin. His flashlight moved in short, controlled arcs, suggesting he'd served somewhere or at least hunted something that could hunt back. Behind him came a heavier man with a thick neck and a shaved head, moving with the clumsy certainty of someone used to being the strongest person in most rooms. A third carried a rifle slung low, not raised yet, but ready. 2 more moved behind them, one with a crowbar, one with a pistol that gleamed briefly in moonlight as he adjusted his grip. Jack didn't count them with fear. He counted them with math. 5. He'd planned for more, but 5 was still manageable if they moved how predators like to move fast toward what they wanted, careless about what wanted them. The dogs made the plan real. Diesel, on Emma's hand signal, slipped down the ravine edge with controlled speed. He didn't bark wildly. He offered just enough sound, one sharp bark that bounced off stone like an insult. Then he flashed his body into the open for a heartbeat, letting the men see a black and tan shape moving away from them. Not a full run. A tease. A challenge. The lead man snapped his flashlight toward the movement. "There," he hissed. The heavier man laughed once, the sound too loud, too pleased. "K9, he said, as if catching the dog was a prize in itself. They surged forward. Diesel retreated exactly as trained, fast enough to look panicked, controlled enough to keep them following the path Jack had chosen. Ranger stayed with Jack, but his muscles tensed, ready for the moment he'd be sent to close a door. The first trap was a pit disguised beneath snow and brittle branches. It wasn't deep, just deep enough to steal ankles and dignity. The tall lead man stepped wide to avoid what he thought was a slick patch. His boot hit the thin crust. The branches snapped. He dropped with a startled grunt, landing hard in the shallow hole, knees jolting, flashlight flying from his hand and spinning across the ravine floor like a falling star. The heavier man behind him lunged to grab him, swearing, stepping too far forward. His foot caught the snare line Emma had set. The wire jerked tight, yanking his leg sideways. He went down in a heavy sprawl, rifle-bearer stumbling to avoid falling on him, and in that stumble, he slid onto the slick ice section Jack had chosen. He flailed, arms windmilling, boots scraping uselessly, and crashed into a fallen log that stopped him with a crack of breath. The ravine filled with noise swears, grunts, the ugly chorus of men losing control. That was the moment Jack moved. He didn't jump down into the chaos. He stayed above it, where advantage lived. He slid along the ridgeline, silent, and dropped behind the man with the pistol, the one who'd hung back, trying to be smart. Jack's hand clamped over the man's mouth, pulling him backward into brush. The man's eyes went wide, pistol jerking up. Jack twisted the wrist sharply, forcing the barrel away, then drove an elbow into the man's ribs. Air left the man in a strangled wheeze. Jack didn't linger. He stripped the pistol, checked the safety by feel, and shoved the man face down into snow, binding his wrists with paracord in one practiced sequence. He moved with a cold mercy. Immobilize, don't mutilate. Emma, across the ravine, did the same kind of work, but with a different flavor. She was law and fury braided together. As the crowbar man tried to scramble up the ravine side, Diesel darted in close enough to force the man to swing, then slipping away at the last second so the crowbar struck a rock and jarred the man's arms numb. Ranger, on Jack's signal, dropped down like a silent weight. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the forearm, clamping just enough to make the crowbar drop, then releasing instantly on Jack's second signal. The man yelped, more shocked than injured, and fell backward into the snow. Emma was on him immediately, knee to back, cuffing with zip ties she'd pulled from Jack's cache. Her face was hard in the moonlight, freckles barely visible now under a sheen of cold sweat. She was not enjoying this. She was enduring it. Diesel circled back to her, tail low, eyes tracking the remaining threats, waiting for the next cue. The rifle bearer recovered first, scrambling up, lifting the rifle toward the ridgeline where he'd seen movement. Jack's stomach tightened. Guns changed the equation, but Emma had anticipated that. She threw a snowball, not childish, not playful, but packed with ice and grit, straight into the rifle bearer's face the moment he lifted his weapon. It hit with a wet crack. The man cursed, blinking hard, rifle dipping. In that split second, Diesel lunged not to bite, but to slam his shoulder into the man's legs. The man went down again, rifle skidding away. Jack sprinted down the ridge, scooped the rifle up, and kicked it farther into the ravine's deepest shadow. He didn't want it in anyone's hands, including his own, for longer than necessary. The tall lead man, still in the pit, tried to stand. His knee buckled. He looked up, face pale, eyes wide with dawning terror as he realized this wasn't a lucky chase. This was an ambush. "Who are you?" he rasped into the night. Jack stepped into view just enough for the man to see the outline of a worn leather jacket and the cold shape of a calm stance. "Someone you shouldn't have followed," Jack said. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact. Within minutes, the ravine went quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. One filled with restrained groans and the soft panting of dogs rather than the hunt's certainty. Jack and Emma moved through the captured men like surgeons. Zip ties, paracord, weapons collected and piled out of reach, phones taken and turned off. Emma's hands shook once when she picked up a pistol, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. Someone had authorized lethal force for a woman and a dog hanging in a warehouse. Jack watched her face and saw her swallow that truth without letting it break her. "We can't leave them here," Emma whispered, voice hoarse. "They'll freeze." Jack nodded, already thinking. "We move them," he said, "somewhere contained." He led them through the trees to an abandoned scrapyard he'd passed on his odd jobs, a place half swallowed by winter where old appliances and rusted car frames lay in drifts like dead beasts. At the edge of it sat a shipping container, painted once in bright blue but now dulled and peeling, doors creaking on stiff hinges. It smelled of metal and old rain. Perfect. Jack and Emma dragged the bound men one by one, not gently, not cruelly, just with the grim efficiency of people who had decided they would not die tonight. Ranger and Diesel flanked them, watching for movement, occasionally pressing their bodies into the men's paths to steer them like livestock. There was something mythic in it. Two dogs, once hung like trophies, now herding their would-be killers into a rusted box. The universe had a dark sense of humor, and tonight it was on the side of justice. Once all 5 men were inside, Jack slammed the container doors shut. The metal clang echoed through the frozen yard like a bell. He looped chain through the handles and locked it with a heavy padlock from the scrap pile, old but solid. Emma leaned forward, hands on her knees, breathing hard. Diesel pressed his head against her thigh, steadying her. Ranger stood near Jack, scanning the tree line, ears pivoting, as if he knew the story wasn't finished. "We need names," Emma said, straightening. Her voice returned to its professional cadence, though her eyes were still wild with adrenaline. "We need proof." Jack pulled out Emma's phone, powered it on only long enough to switch it to airplane mode, and opened the camera. "Record," he said. "No signal, just evidence." Emma nodded, and the act of doing something procedural, something lawful, seemed to anchor her. She approached the container door, voice firm. "Who sent you?" she demanded. Inside, a chorus of curses answered, then a laugh, thin and bitter. "You don't get it," the tall lead man called back, voice strained. "You're already dead. We're just the delivery." Emma's jaw clenched. "Name," she said again, sharper. Silence. Then the heavier man, the shaved-headed one, muttered something to his companions, angry, scared. Jack listened, then spoke in a tone that carried like a blade, without shouting. "You can freeze in there," he said, "or you can talk and earn a blanket." It was not kindness. It was leverage. Ranger huffed softly, as if amused by human bargaining. A pause, then the lead man's voice came again, softer now. "Boss ain't coming for you," he said. "Boss already owns the town." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Who?" she said, voice like ice. The man hesitated, and Jack heard fear shift into resignation. "Chief Kane," the man finally spat, as if the name tasted rotten. "Robert Kane." "Your chief. He told us to keep you quiet. Told us to make the dog disappear, too. Said you were getting nosy." Emma's face went blank, not because she didn't feel, but because feeling would have knocked her down and she refused to fall. In that blankness was devastation and fury, braided so tight it looked like calm. Diesel let out a low growl, sensing her shift. Ranger stepped closer to Jack, shoulder brushing his leg, grounding him. Jack's stomach tightened. A police chief. The leak wasn't a crack. It was the foundation. Emma's voice came out steady, but Jack could hear the tremor buried deep. "Say it again," she ordered, lifting the phone camera. The man repeated it, louder this time, and another voice from inside the container, someone younger, panicking, confirmed it with a string of details. Meetings, payoffs, a promise that the sheriff's office would lose reports. Emma recorded it all, her face lit by the faint glow of the phone screen, freckles like scattered ash, eyes like a storm. When she finished, she stepped back and exhaled a breath that looked like smoke. "My chief," she whispered, and the words sounded like grief. Jack didn't touch her. He didn't offer comfort that would ring hollow. He simply said, "Now we know where the rod is." Emma turned to him, and in her gaze, Jack saw something shift, the last thread of naive loyalty snapping clean. "And now we do something about it," she said. Jack nodded, and in the cold light of the scrapyard, with a rusted container holding 5 men and 2 dogs standing guard like mythic sentinels, the music of justice began to form, not loud, not pretty, but relentless. The scrapyard slept under a fresh blanket of snow, and the shipping container sat in it like a rusted coffin that refused to stay buried. Moonlight glazed the metal doors, highlighting the chained handles and the padlock that held 5 men and their lies inside. Jack Mercer stood a few steps away, shoulders squared beneath the worn brown leather jacket, breath steady, listening to the muffled thumps and curses from within as if they were just another kind of weather. Ranger sat at his left, posture calm but ready, eyes tracking the tree line. Diesel leaned against Emma Hayes's leg, as if he could sense the tremor under her skin that she refused to show. Emma watched the container door as if it might suddenly speak the truth louder. Her face was lit by her phone screen again. Blue light on freckles, blue light on exhaustion, and her eyes weren't the same eyes that had walked into the warehouse yesterday. Those eyes had believed in procedure. These eyes believed in patterns. "If I report this through county," Emma said, voice low, "Kane will see it before anyone else does." The name felt poisonous now. Chief Robert Kane. Her chief. Her superior. The man whose signature had likely approved her training, whose handshake had probably congratulated her when she earned her badge, whose smile had felt like safety because that was what chiefs were supposed to be. Jack didn't answer right away. He was studying her, not in a tender way, but in the way a man studied a bridge before stepping on it. She was holding herself upright on discipline alone, and discipline had limits. "Then you don't report it through county," Jack said finally. Emma's jaw tightened. "There are channels," she whispered, "but Kane controls most of them." Jack's eyes moved to the phone, then to the container, then back to Emma. "You need a channel he can't touch," he said, "outside his reach." Emma's gaze drifted down as if the answer had been in her pocket all along. "Internal Affairs," she murmured. "State Police." She said it like someone tasting a risky medicine, necessary, bitter. "Do you have numbers?" Jack asked. Emma nodded once, already moving. She powered her phone on only long enough to use a secure contact list she'd kept for emergencies, names she'd been told to call if a fellow officer went missing or if corruption reached too high to climb over. The snow around them crackled under her boots as she paced a few steps away from the container, lowering her voice as if the forest might carry it to the wrong ears. Jack watched her carefully. Emma wasn't just making a call, she was committing treason against her own chain of command, which meant she was committing loyalty to something bigger than the chain, the oath behind it. She selected a contact labeled "A Salem Liaison" and stared at it for a second, hesitating the way you hesitate before jumping into cold water. Then she tapped. The call connected after 2 rings. A woman's voice answered, flat, professional, unmistakably alert even through a weak signal. "This is Lieutenant Mariah Sloan, Internal Affairs," the voice said. "Identify." Emma's shoulders lifted and then squared. "Officer Emma Hayes, Pine Hollow PD," she replied. "Badge number 3147. I'm calling from outside town. I have evidence of criminal conspiracy involving Chief Robert Kane." Jack heard the name Sloan and imagined a woman who'd built her spine out of paperwork and fire. He didn't need to see her to picture her. Mid-40s, perhaps, hair pulled tight, eyes tired of lies, voice honed by hearings where men tried to talk their way out of consequences. Emma kept speaking, controlled and concise. She gave the essentials: the warehouse attack, the pursuit, the captured men, the recorded confession naming Kane, the container location. "I can send video and audio," Emma said, "but I can't use local channels. I believe the department is compromised." On the other end, the IA lieutenant went silent for a beat, that specific silence of someone verifying whether this was real or a trap. Then Sloane's tone sharpened, less like a desk officer and more like a blade. "Do not contact your department," she said. "Do not return to your station. Hold your evidence. I am notifying Oregon State Police. You will receive instructions from a state unit. Where are you now?" Emma glanced at Jack. Jack shook his head, small but firm. No exact coordinates yet. Emma answered with a broad landmark only north of the old timber yard near the junk lot, giving enough for a state team to find them with guidance, not enough for a leak to pinpoint them instantly. Sloan accepted it. "Stay alive," she said, voice clipped with a kind of grim care. "If this is true, he will try to clean it up." The line went dead. Emma exhaled, and Jack saw her hands shake for the first time since the warehouse. The shaking wasn't fear of the criminals. It was fear of the institution she'd just declared rotten. Diesel pressed closer, head nudging her thigh. Ranger's ears flicked toward the trees as if he could hear the future approaching. "Now," Jack said, "we decide how to make Kane show his face." Emma looked at him, eyes bright with cold fury. "He'll come," she said. "Not for me, for the evidence." Jack nodded. "Then we make it look like you're offering him a clean ending," he said. "A gift." Emma's mouth tightened. "A trap," she corrected. Jack's expression barely shifted. "A stage," he said. "He thinks he's the director." Emma's eyes narrowed, understanding forming like ice. She pulled her phone back out and began composing a message the way a hunter baited a snare, careful, believable, built from the habits of the prey. She recorded a short voice note addressed to Kane, using the tone she would have used in a normal debrief. Tired, factual, seeking approval. "Chief," she said into the mic, voice steady but cracked with staged exhaustion. "I picked up 2 suspects near the old timber yard. They're talking. I have partial evidence on my phone. I'm off-grid because I didn't trust dispatch after last night. I need guidance. I can meet you to hand this over discreetly. I don't want this going through the wrong hands." Emma stopped recording and looked at Jack as if asking whether she'd overplayed it. Jack shook his head. "Perfect," he said. "You appealed to his vanity and his fear." Emma swallowed. "How do I send it without broadcasting a trail?" Jack lifted the cheap handheld radio, then shook his head. "Don't," he said. "We use what he already has." He reached into the pockets of one of the captured men, careful, methodical, and pulled out a prepaid phone. It was cheap plastic, screen cracked, no lock code, a disposable tool for disposable people. Jack powered it on, found a contact labeled K, and handed it to Emma. "Send from them," Jack said. "Make it look like they recovered you and you're calling in." Emma nodded slowly, impressed despite herself. She sent the voice note and a simple instruction. "Come alone. Bring your SUV. Headlights off. I'm near the scrapyard." Then she shut the phone off and snapped it in half with a decisive twist, tossing the pieces into the snow like bones. The night moved forward in long, tense minutes. Jack and Emma positioned themselves with the dogs near the scrapyard's edge, using wrecked cars as cover. Ranger stayed on Jack's side, Diesel on Emma's, but the dogs occasionally glanced at each other, a shared awareness running between them. They were both tired. They were both hurt. They were both still willing. The container thumped again as the men inside realized the game had changed. Jack ignored it. Emma ignored it. Their real target wasn't in the box. Their target wore a uniform and a smile. A pair of headlights appeared on the access road just after midnight, low beams slicing through trees. The vehicle rolled in slow, cautious. Jack's eyes sharpened. Not a truck, an SUV. Black. Clean. The kind of clean that didn't belong in a junkyard. It stopped a good distance from the container, engine idling like an animal refusing to relax. A man stepped out. Even at a distance, Jack could read him. Tall, late 50s maybe, broad in the shoulders, in a way that came from years of authority rather than labor. He wore a dark overcoat that looked expensive, collar up against the cold. His hair was silver, cut neat. His face had the harsh angles of someone who had learned to hide contempt behind professionalism. Strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that scanned the lot with practiced suspicion. Chief Robert Kane moved like he owned the air, the kind of man who smiled at funerals and called it leadership. He walked toward the container with a flashlight held low, beam tight, as if he didn't want anyone else to see what he was doing. He stopped by the chained doors and leaned in, listening. The men inside started shouting. Kane hissed something back, angry, urgent. His voice carried only fragments, but the tone was unmistakable. Not concern, not justice, control. Emma watched him from behind a wrecked sedan, her face pale, eyes locked, hands clenched so tight her knuckles whitened. Diesel trembled, not from cold now but from tension, his eyes fixed on Kane as if he remembered the rope. Jack put a steadying hand on Ranger's scruff. Ranger's ears stood forward like antennae. Kane turned, sweeping his flashlight around the yard. "Emma," he called, voice smooth and almost fatherly. "Come out. Let's handle this." Emma's breath hitched. Jack leaned close, whispering, "Wait." Emma's eyes glistened, fury and grief fighting in her throat. She stayed still. Kane's smile tightened. The fatherly mask slipped for a second, revealing something colder beneath. "You think you're clever," he said, voice lowering. "But you're not. You're tired, and you're hurt, and you're in the wrong place." He stepped closer to the row of junked cars, flashlight beam cutting across metal. "Where's the evidence?" he demanded. The friendliness gone now, voice sharp with entitlement. Emma's jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. She raised her phone silently, camera rolling, capturing his words. Jack nodded once. "Good. Let him talk." Kane took another step, and in that moment the night split open with a different kind of light, bright, harsh, undeniable. Multiple headlights flared at the far end of the yard, flooding the snow and rust with white glare. Blue and red strobes erupted, not from Pine Hollow's soft little patrol cars, but from state vehicles with heavier presence. Oregon State Police units rolled in like judgment. Kane froze mid-step. His flashlight dropped slightly, beam wobbling. His head turned toward the lights with the slow disbelief of a man who had never imagined the world could say no to him. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, calm and absolute. "Chief Robert Kane, put your hands where we can see them. Do not move." Kane's face changed, not into panic, but into calculation, the kind of calculation that had likely saved him before. He lifted his hands slowly, palms out, and tried to smile again, as if charisma could rewrite reality. "This is a misunderstanding," he called, voice too loud. "I'm here to help my officer." Emma rose from cover then, stepping into the open like a blade stepping into light. "No," she said, voice steady and clear. "You're here to erase me." Kane's eyes snapped to her, and for a heartbeat the mask slipped completely. In that slip was contempt and something like hate. Then the state troopers were on him. Two figures in dark uniforms moving fast, professional, pinning his wrists, cuffing him with a sound that rang louder than any gunshot, metal closing on consequence. A woman stepped out from one of the state vehicles, tall and straight-backed, hair dark and pulled into a tight bun, face sharp with focus. She moved with the controlled authority of someone who had walked into corrupt rooms before and watched powerful men shrink. "Officer Hayes?" she called. Emma nodded, swallowing hard. The woman introduced herself with clipped precision, Captain Elise Merrow, Oregon State Police eyes assessing the scene, the container, the dogs, the civilians. She didn't look surprised by the ugliness. She looked prepared for it. "We received your IA referral," Merrow said, "and your evidence." Emma's shoulders sagged for half a second. Not weakness, release. Jack stood back, letting the system, this higher, cleaner piece of it, do what it was meant to do. Ranger sat at Jack's side, calm now, as if the danger had finally exhaled. Diesel pressed against Emma, and when she crouched, Diesel licked her wrist, once gentle, grounding, almost comically tender after everything. Emma let out a small laugh that sounded half like a sob, half like a person remembering how to live. Kane was escorted past them, face pale under the strobes. He tried once more to speak, but Captain Merrow cut him off with a look that said the era of his voice being the loudest was over. The rest didn't explode into fireworks. It settled. Paperwork began. Troopers opened the container, pulled the captured men out, separated them, photographed weapons, took statements. Emma handed over her recordings, voice steadying as she explained. Jack gave his name and little else, because he had learned that staying alive sometimes meant staying uninteresting. Merrow looked at him longer than necessary, seeing the posture, the quiet competence, the dogs. "You're ex-military," she said, not accusing, simply reading. Jack nodded once. "Retired," he replied. Merrow's gaze softened by a hair. "Tonight you weren't," she said. Jack didn't respond. Compliments felt like coins he didn't know where to spend. By dawn the snow had stopped. The sky turned pale, and light slipped through the trees without menace. Jack stood on the porch of his cabin later, breath rising in small ghosts, the world hushed in that clean after-storm way. Ranger lay at his boots, eyes half closed, body finally allowing rest. Diesel lay beside Ranger, close enough that their fur touched, two working dogs sharing warmth like an oath. Emma stood near the railing, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, hair loose, face still bruised by fatigue. But her eyes had changed again. They were softer now, not naive soft, but human soft. She looked out at the snow and let herself smile, small, crooked, the kind of smile that carried pain and survival in equal measure. "I used to think the badge meant the truth," she said quietly, "like the medal itself could keep people clean." Jack stared out at the trees. "Metal rusts," he said. "People do too." Emma's laugh came again, faint but real. Diesel's tail thumped once. Ranger didn't move, but his ear flicked, as if amused at the humans learning obvious lessons late. Emma breathed in the cold air, then exhaled like she was letting something heavy go. "I don't believe in perfect systems anymore," she said, "but I believe in chosen trust." Jack nodded, gaze on the pale horizon. "That's the kind worth keeping," he said. The dawn didn't roar. It didn't cheer. It simply arrived, steady and white, and for the first time in days, nobody flinched at the sound of an engine. In the end, the miracle didn't arrive with fireworks or thunder. It arrived the way God often answers, quietly, steadily, like dawn laying a clean hand on a world that thought it was doomed. Two dogs who had been lifted like trophies came home with their paws on the ground again. A woman who had been betrayed by a badge learned that truth isn't owned by titles, it's carried by the brave. And a man who tried to bury his past found that God can turn even old wounds into shelter for someone else. That's the mystery of grace. Evil shouts to terrify, but heaven whispers to guide, and the whisper lasts longer. Maybe that's the miracle some of us need most, not the sudden disappearance of storms, but the strength to keep doing what's right while the storm is still howling. In everyday life, the forest looks different. It might be a hard week, a broken promise, a sickness in the family, or a moment when trust feels risky. But the lesson is the same. Choose courage in small steps. Protect what is good. Speak truth even when it costs you. And if you can't fix the whole world, be faithful in your corner of it, because God builds big miracles from small obediences. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever seen a quiet miracle in your own life, we'd love to read it. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story of loyalty, faith, and courage. And before you go, let's pray together. May God bless you and keep you. May He guard your home, your loved ones, and every faithful companion who walks beside you. May He give you peace that doesn't depend on circumstances and a brave heart that chooses love over fear. Amen.